Duck, Duck was the type of guy who would come out the game and put a dip in his mouth.
A big man who can handle the rock and hit a cutter in stride. A center who will fight for the tough points down low or hit it from deep. So who am I talking about? Well, obviously Brad Miller. Miller's numbers were never crazy, but they filled a lot of columns on the stat sheet. Coming into the league in the late 90s, at a time when a center's offensive value was reliant on their post scoring, Miller preferred to get his teammates involved first and had an outside shooting touch that most pivots didn't. And while it took some time to find his fit, he would make all-star appearances with two different teams in the mid-2000s and would be the perfect successor to Vlade Divac in Sacramento. He could have probably put up better scoring numbers if he wanted to, but the team game was his game. And a 14-year career after going undrafted, it doesn't get much better than that.
A dip in your mouth
during the game
and still get buckets.
Let's jog your memory. Growing up in Kendallville, Indiana, Brad Miller would star for his local East Noble High School, averaging 17 points and 9 boards as a junior, while garnering some recruitment attention. But going into his senior season, he was set to be suspended for the first half of the year due to violating team rules by not only spending time in a bar during his recruitment visit to Oklahoma State, but also drinking. And while Miller didn't want to leave East Noble, he also didn't want to miss half the season. So he would transfer to the Maine Central Institute Prep School for his senior year. But he wouldn't be away from home long, as during the fall, he would commit to Purdue. And while Miller would miss some time with a back injury as a senior, overall he played great against tougher competition, averaging 17 points and 11.5 rebounds. But the next test was coming, as he returned to his home state for some Big Ten basketball. So Miller joined a Purdue team that looked weaker than expected after Glenn Robinson had left for the NBA a year early. And while they still had senior Konzo Martin, their offense would take a pretty big hit in '95. But they were still a good defensive team. Yet they were also a small team, as Miller was one of 2 players on the roster over 6'8". However, his skill set didn't match his size, and that was because he began high school as a 5'11" guard. But by his junior year, he was 6'9". So while he had grown into a post player, he still had solid handles and a soft shooting touch. And now with Miller being able to see over the heads of most defenders, his passing became one of his greatest weapons. But over the first half of the season, he was being used in a backup role, yet was producing. But by January, he was a starter. And while his season averages were modest, his versatility and hustle gave Purdue a boost on both ends of the floor, and also helped the Boilermakers finish the season at 24-6, after they had started a disappointing 3-3, as this year would see them take home the Big Ten regular season title. And then their NCAA tournament would begin with a low-scoring win over Green Bay, with Miller putting up 6 points and 9 boards. Then while Miller dropped 9 points in round 2, Purdue would come up just short against Memphis, as Miller struggled against Lorenzen Wright. But Miller's freshman year had seen him average about 6.5 points, 5 rebounds, and 1 assist per game. With Martin graduating, the team would count on the play of Miller and fellow sophomore Chad Austin in '96. Yet while Miller was the team's second leading scorer, he only started 1 game, as a case of the flu took Miller out of the starting lineup in the second game of the year, and head coach Gene Cady kept him coming off the bench the rest of the season. So again, Miller put up modest stats as a sophomore, yet was still one of the team's best players. And with Purdue being a defensive team, no one was putting up huge scoring numbers. But they were winning, as after losing the season opener to Memphis, they lost just 4 more games the rest of the season, with Miller coming off the bench, and again won the Big Ten regular season title, as overall they finished at 25-5 and ranked as high as number 4 in the nation, entering a first-round tournament matchup with Western Carolina. And while Miller had just 4 points in 18 minutes off the bench, the Boilermakers narrowly survived. But then top-seeded Purdue couldn't overcome Georgia in the second round, as Miller tallied 8 points before fouling out, with his sophomore season ending with him averaging about 9.5 points, 5 rebounds, and 1.5 assists per game. But come his junior year, Miller was named captain, and would really show what he could do. Purdue welcomed a good freshman class, which included future NBAer Brian Cardinal, but the normally stingy Purdue defense was no more. However, their offense hadn't changed much from last year, as they would have a down season compared to the last couple of years. However, Miller had become more serious about his physical and mental shape, and would produce better than ever as a junior. as he was receiving 31 minutes per game while averaging over 14 points and 8 rebounds on efficient shooting. And his most impressive contribution was his distribution, as the 6'11 center would lead the Boilermakers in assists at nearly 3 per game. And defensively, he was one of the conference's top shot blockers. However, the team wouldn't be able to string together many wins, as they hovered right around 500 most of the season, until catching fire near the end of the year. And after a huge performance by Miller in the season finale versus Illinois, Purdue finished with a solid 17-11 record and an at-large bid to the NCAA tournament to take on Rhode Island. And while it was a slow start for Purdue, they would stage a second-half comeback and an overtime win on the back of a 31-point, 8-rebound performance from Miller. But the second round brought a top-seeded Kansas team, and while Miller had a solid 15-10, Kansas was just too much. As Purdue's season ended, with Miller putting up averages of about 14.5 points, 8.5 rebounds, and 3 assists per game, Purdue would look like a whole different team in 1998, as they became one of the nation's most high-powered offenses. And leading the way was Brad Miller, setting career highs in both scoring and rebounding, while improving his efficiency from last year. And with Miller again putting his passing on display, it contributed to 5 Boilermakers averaging at least 11 points. And while Purdue wasn't a great defensive team, they didn't have to be with such a great offense, as they were overpowering teams throughout the regular season and easily surpassed last year's win total. And Miller would even play through some of the worst conditions imaginable late in the season. But when it was all said and done, the Boilermakers finished the regular season at 24-6. And in the first year of the Big Ten Conference Tournament, Purdue would make it all the way to the finals before losing to Michigan. But they still got a bid to the NCAA tournament and would run through Delaware in round 1, as Miller had an all-around performance with 15 points, 6 boards, 4 assists, and 6 steals. Then Miller finally got out of the second round after he put up 18 and 11 in a win over Detroit Mercy. But the Sweet 16 was as far as they'd get, as while Miller dropped 13 and 11, Purdue fell to Stanford, and Miller ended his senior season with averages of about 17 points, 9 rebounds, and 2.5 assists per game. So Miller ended his college career as one of the most versatile big men in recent memory, with shades of Bill Walton in his game, who just happened to be his idol. And one of his biggest strengths hadn't even been on display throughout his time at Purdue, as while Katie always knew that Miller was one of their top 3-point shooters, Miller never really shot them. And while there were concerns about his offensive aggressiveness, he was an intriguing talent as a floor-spacing big with guard-like passing vision. But was he an NBA-level prospect? Well, it didn't seem like it, as he would go undrafted. But almost immediately, he was invited to the Hornets minicamp. But then just days after that, the lockout began, and Miller had no contract. So first, he would win a bronze medal in the FIBA World Championships on a US team consisting of no NBA players due to the lockout. Then he would begin his professional career overseas, spending a few months in Italy. But when the lockout ended, Miller returned to America and was given a spot on the Hornets for the '99 season. And while Miller played modest minutes in a bench role, he was exceptionally productive, with starter-level per 36 stats, and would even put up a season-high 32 points in the final game of the year against Boston. And the Hornets were solid, as they would manage a 26-24 record. However, this wouldn't be enough for the playoffs, as Miller's rookie year ended with him averaging about 6.5 points, 3 rebounds, and half an assist per game. Miller saw a slight minutes increase in 2000, but as he was getting more defensive attention, he was finding it hard to adjust, while also missing significant time with a knee injury. But he was still contributing, especially on the glass, with noticeable improvement in his rebounding. And even though Miller missed a lot of time after the All-Star break, a Hornets team who would get an All-Star season from Eddie Jones were looking good and would rack up 49 wins on the year to get a first-round playoff matchup with Philadelphia. And Miller would have 13 points and 6 boards in his playoff debut. But his minutes dropped with every game after that, as Charlotte ultimately lost in 4, with Miller's season seeing him average about 7.5 points, 5.5 rebounds, and an assist per game. Miller was a restricted free agent after the season, but his time in Charlotte came to an end when he signed a 2-year, $12 million deal with Chicago heading into the 01 season, as he was joining a Bulls team with some other promising young players in Elton Brand and Ron Artest. And Miller would primarily act as the team's starting center when he was on the court, except once again, he missed significant time. this time due to a broken hand suffered early in the season. But when Miller was on the court, he was looking solid. He was still having some troubles with the physicality of NBA defenses, as his efficiency wasn't what you wanted for a center. But he continued to work hard on the glass and was getting more of an opportunity to show his passing, as he averaged nearly 2 assists per game. But this was a Bulls team who were still recovering from Michael Jordan's retirement a few years earlier, and with little direction, along with the league's worst offense, they would finish at 15-67, as Miller's first year in Chicago had seen him average about 9 points, 7.5 rebounds, and 2 assists per game. The offseason had seen the Bulls trade away Elton Brand and bring in 2 high-potential rookie big men in Eddie Curry and Tyson Chandler. And while these 2 were going to be projects, it was clear that was the direction that the team was going in, so it seemed unlikely for Miller to be a part of their long-term plans. However, as the season progressed, a leaner Brad Miller was having the best year of his career. Without Brand, Miller became their best post scorer, but he was also displaying a more consistent mid-range shot, and over his first 48 games, he was putting up career highs across the board, but it wasn't translating to much more winning. And with Chicago looking for a proven veteran, they packaged Miller, Artest, and Ron Mercer to the Pacers for Jalen Rose. So for the rest of the season, Miller was back home as the Pacers starting center and was doing even better than he had in Chicago, bringing a much needed toughness to the Pacers and giving them a solid center that defenses had to respect. But with defenses also respecting a young Jermaine O'Neal and Miller having a great mid-range shot, he got more open looks and scored more efficiently than he had in Chicago. And with the Pacers sitting at 26-27 at the time of the trade, they would improve enough to finish at 42-40 and get the East's final playoff spot to take on New Jersey. Miller would have a great series, beginning with 18 points and 12 boards as the Pacers stole Game 1 in New Jersey. Then he would hit double figures in all but one game the rest of the way, as the Pacers unexpectedly pushed New Jersey the distance. And in Game 5, Miller dropped 14 points and pulled down 17 rebounds. And while this game was a battle, Indiana would fall in double OT, as Miller's overall season had seen him average about 13.5 points, 8 rebounds, and 2 assists per game. But the undrafted Miller would get some league-wide recognition in 2003. Miller would spend the entire season as Indiana's starting center, acting as the team's 3rd leading scorer and 2nd leading rebounder. And his ability to stretch the floor made the Pacers more dangerous on offense, as it took some attention off the budding star O'Neal, but also opened up the lane for cutters, with Miller being more than capable of locating an open man from the low block or the top of the key. And on defense, Miller would usually check the more physical big man, so O'Neal would take less of a beating. And with Ron Artest having a breakout year, and the ageless Reggie Miller still producing, the Pacers roster was working well together. And Brad Miller was playing great heading into the All-Star break on a 34-15 Pacers team, as he would be rewarded with a spot on the All-Star team. But about a month after the break, Miller would see his play suffer as he dealt with a foot injury, and the Pacers were crumbling. However, they would recover in time to end the year at 48-34 and get a first-round matchup with Boston. Miller started the series well, averaging over 12 points and nearly 4 assists over the first 4 games. Yet Indiana found themselves down 3-1. Then Miller would struggle the rest of the series, going 0 for 6 over the next 2 games, as Boston closed it out in 6, with Miller's season ending with him averaging about 13 points, 8.5 rebounds, and 2.5 assists per game. But shortly after the season, Brad Miller was on the move again. Indiana didn't want to lose the free agent Miller, but they couldn't afford to keep him, so instead they would send him to Sacramento in a sign-and-trade. But it wasn't a bad situation, as while the Kings still featured every starter from their 0-2 conference finals team, Vlade Divac was 35 years old and didn't have much left in the tank, and Miller seemed like a perfect replacement. Yet he would start the season playing alongside Divac, as Chris Webber recovered from a knee injury and didn't return until March. Yet while Miller wasn't the scorer that Webber was, he was still very involved and had taken on a lot of Webber's offensive responsibilities, as he would record then career highs in scoring and assists, while also averaging double-digit rebounds for the only time in his career, as he would record a career-high 32 double-doubles, while even recording 2 triple-doubles. And with Miller being so important to the Kings' second-ranked offense, he was awarded with his 2nd straight All-Star selection. And even without Webber, the Kings weren't missing a beat, And when Webber returned, Miller transitioned into a sixth-man role. And while he saw his numbers drop, his production off the bench was extremely impressive, as the Kings would cruise to a 55-27 record and a first-round matchup with Dallas. Yet while Sacramento jumped out to a 2-1 lead, a banged-up Miller hadn't played a big role in that. But he came to life in Game 4, with 10 points, 16 boards, and 5 assists. Then after dropping 21, 5, and 6 in 44 minutes, after Divac was benched early in Game 5, the Kings were advancing to take on League MVP Kevin Garnett and the T-Wolves in Round 2. Divac was back in the starting lineup for this series, but Miller was still contributing off the bench, as he recorded double-doubles in the first 2 games, then had a series-high 20 points in Game 4, as the teams were knotted at 2. And then after a Game 5 loss, where Miller was held scoreless, he put up 17, 7, and 5 without a miss in a Game 6 win. But Game 7 would end in defeat for Sacramento, as Miller's first year with the Kings ended with him averaging about 14 points, 10.5 rebounds, and 4.5 assists per game. With how well Miller played, the Kings would not re-sign Divac, as Miller became their starting center in 05. And while he wouldn't receive a third All-Star selection, he would have arguably the best year of his career, as he would put up his highest scoring numbers and even dropped a career-high 38 points in a March 2nd win over Golden State, while still averaging over 9 rebounds and nearly 4 assists, on the second highest shooting percentage of his career, as he would even finish with the league's highest offensive rating. And defensively, he would average a steal and a block for the first time ever. But the greatest show on court was being disbanded throughout the season, as Doug Christie would be traded away in January. Then at the deadline, Webber was sent to the Sixers. And if that wasn't bad enough, just days after the Webber trade, Miller was forced out with a calf injury. Then in mid-March, he would fracture his fibula during practice, which would end his regular season. However, Mike Bibby and Peja Stojakovic would keep the Kings afloat, as they still managed 50 wins and got a first-round matchup with Seattle. And while Miller wasn't 100%, he returned for the series, initially coming off the bench before rejoining the starting lineup and dropping at least 14 points in games 3 through 5. But even though he had a 14-point, 11-assist performance in Game 5, the Sonics won the game and the series, as Miller's season had ended with him averaging about 15.5 points, 9.5 rebounds, and 4 assists per game. More change came in 2006, as a mid-season trade would see Stojakovic sent to Indiana, and in return, the Kings received one of Miller's old teammates in Ron Artest, and this would give their defense an immediate boost. And while they were no longer the greatest show on court, at times it looked quite similar, with Miller often playing the two-man game with either Bibby or a second-year Kevin Martin, and continuing to deliver his pinpoint passes, as Miller's career-high 4.7 assists per game were second to Bibby. Unfortunately, the days of the high-scoring Sacramento Kings were over, as offensively they were a middle-of-the-pack team in 2006. But Miller was still one of their top scorers, and had really incorporated the three ball into his game, as after attempting 89 total threes over his first 7 years, he attempted 88 in this year alone, and made over 38% of them. And while these weren't the same Kings, they caught fire at the right time, winning 9 of their final 11 to secure the West's final playoff spot, and a matchup with the Spurs. But going against an elite Spurs defense led by Tim Duncan resulted in Miller having the worst series of his career, averaging less than 10 points and 3 rebounds, while only shooting about 40%. He would have an efficient 19-point game to even the series at 2 games apiece, but after Miller scored just 3 points in Game 6, the Spurs wrapped up the series, as Miller's year ended with him averaging about 15 points, 8 rebounds, and 4.5 assists per game. The Kings had a new coach in 07 in Eric Musselman, yet it never seemed like the players bought into him after losing longtime coach Rick Adelman. And with Musselman wanting to take a more defensive approach, it didn't bode well for Miller, who wasn't really known for his defense. But Miller's production on offense would also drastically decrease, and while he did deal with some injuries throughout the season, he was putting up single-digit scoring for the first time since he was in Chicago, and also putting up some of the lowest rebounding numbers of his career. And with the Kings pushing the pace more than they had last year, a now 30-year-old Miller had less opportunity to play his game in the half court. And whatever the Kings were doing, it wasn't working, as for the first time in nearly a decade, they would miss the playoffs, after finishing with a 33-49 record. as Miller's down year had ended with him averaging about 9 points, 6.5 rebounds, and 3.5 assists per game. It was another new coach in 2008 as the Kings brought in Reggie Theus, but a more dedicated Miller would again become one of Sacramento's most consistent offensive producers. Both Artest and Martin missed over 20 games, and Bibby only appeared in 15 before being traded to Atlanta. So with Miller playing and starting in 72 games, he saw noticeable spikes in his scoring and rebounding, even recording 2 games with at least 20 points and 20 rebounds. And his 90 attempted threes were a then career high. Yet while he played well, the Kings were often shorthanded, and because of this, were only able to manage 38 wins, and would again miss the playoffs, as Miller's season had ended with him averaging about 13.5 points, 9.5 rebounds, and 3.5 assists per game. Miller began the 09 season with the Kings, but at this point it was clear that they were heading towards a rebuild, and with Miller set to turn 32 this season, while still having another year left on his big contract, he didn't really fit their long-term plans. Yet even in year 11, Miller was continuing to produce effectively, as one of their top scorers and rebounders over the first half of the year. So while he still had value, the Kings would include him in a package to Chicago at the trade deadline. So Miller was now a Chicago Bull for the second time in his career, but the team looked a lot different with the high-scoring guard duo of Ben Gordon and rookie Derrick Rose, as well as a young center in Joakim Noah. So the veteran Miller would be as valuable in the locker room as he was on the court, and he would be quite valuable on the court, as he gave the Bulls added toughness and a reliable scorer on offense, while also providing floor spacing to open up the lane for Rose and Gordon, as Miller became an important second-unit player for Chicago, who would finish with a 41-41 record, which was enough for a playoff matchup with the defending champion Boston Celtics. While this series would be most memorable for Ben Gordon's performance, Miller was solid for Chicago off the bench. He was up and down scoring-wise, but would still hit double figures in 3 games, and was one of Chicago's best rebounders all series. And the Bulls were hanging with the Celtics, as they were tied after 4 games. And Miller had a chance to tie it at the free throw line in overtime of Game 5, but he missed the first, then had to miss the second, and the Bulls would lose. And while Miller would come back in Game 6 with 23 and 10 on 8 of 9 shooting to help extend the series, there would be no upset, as Boston took it in 7, and Miller's overall season ended with him averaging about 12 points, 8 rebounds, and 3.5 assists per game. Miller remained a Bull for the 2010 season as a backup center, and while he was playing less minutes, it helped him avoid injury, as this year would see him appear in all 82 games for the first and only time in his career, as he would continue as a solid defensive rebounder and passer, while also taking a career-high 132 three-pointers, yet only converting on 28% of them. And when Noah went down in early February, Miller slotted into the starting lineup for the next 2 months, and helped keep the Bulls competitive, going 12-15 in that time, and again finishing with a 41-41 record, to secure the East's final playoff spot and a matchup with the Cavs. But Miller would struggle in this series, as his minutes fell and he shot 37% from the field, in what ended up being a 5-game loss for Chicago, as Miller's year had seen him average about 9 points, 5 rebounds, and 2 assists per game. And now Miller's contract was up, and the Bulls wouldn't bring him back. So Miller would sign a 3-year deal with the Rockets, who needed some center depth, as Yao Ming's foot injuries were getting worse, and would lead to him playing only 5 games in 2011. Yet even with Yao missing pretty much the whole season, Miller was still used in a backup role, again spending a lot more time on the perimeter, and often being used as a facilitator when he was on the floor. His first 36 games would be his most productive, as he would even drop at least 20 points 4 times. But after that, knee issues would limit him to just 24 more games, and severely hinder him when he did play, for a Rockets team who finished at 43-39 and missed the playoffs, as Miller averaged about 6.5 points, 3.5 rebounds, and 2.5 assists per game. Over the offseason, Miller underwent microfracture surgery on his knee. Then shortly after, he was included in a trade to Minnesota. And even with the lockout, Miller would get a late start to the season, as he was still recovering from the surgery. And when he came back, he was mostly in a veteran leadership role, as he appeared in just 15 games, finishing the season with 4 points, 4 boards, and 4 assists in the finale, as Minnesota missed the playoffs. And Miller had averaged about 2.5 points, 1.5 rebounds, and 1.5 assists per game. So while it came after some deliberation, following 2 trades, and being waived during the 2012 offseason, Brad Miller would decide to retire after 14 seasons. Brad Miller is yet another one of those guys who would likely have more success in another era. Luckily, the Rick Adelman Kings were probably the best situation for him in regards to playstyle. But overall, centers like him just weren't as valued when he was in his prime during the mid-2000s. But sticking around the league for as long as he did, as a center that only gave you about 15 points at his peak, speaks volumes to everything else he could do. One of the best and least talked about passing big men of all time, and one of the more forgotten stretch fives. Brad Miller was unique in that regard, and while he was criticized for his flopping, he still wasn't afraid to mix it up and do the dirty work, like a more traditional big. But most admirable is that even after going undrafted, Miller stayed true to his game and has 2 All-Star appearances to show for it. But that's it for today's episode on Brad Miller. Hope you enjoyed it, and make sure to subscribe for more videos like this one. If you liked it, check out this one on one of his early career Bulls teammates, or this one on one of his Kings teammates. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.